And welcome to our webinar on assessment literacy today. My name's Kat and I'm going to be your moderator, and I'm very pleased to introduce you to Nathaniel Owen. Nathaniel is a Senior Research and Validation Manager here at Oxford University Press. He joined OUP in February 2020 and he holds a PhD in language testing from the University of Leicester and has published articles and book chapters on subjects including language testing, research methods in education, and widening participation in higher education. He has also experience of teaching English as a foreign language in Spain, the UK, and Australia, with expertise in teaching EAP and exam preparation courses. Today, he will introduce you to key concepts in language assessment literacy and practical approaches to dealing with the demands of language assessment in the classroom. Over to you now, Nathaniel.
Thanks very much, Kat. Okay, so in this session today, we're going to be discussing what we mean by assessment literacy, how this links to a familiar concept of assessment for learning. So in other words, how we can go about embedding assessment within classrooms, and what do we need to know about assessment in order to use it to enhance learning opportunities for students. And in order to do this, we need to discuss important test concepts. And those include test purpose. Some of you may be familiar with norm and criterion referenced approaches to testing. Core concepts including validity and reliability. And we're also going to discuss washback and what we mean by that. And within that, we're going to talk briefly about test fairness as well. And then at the end of the session, we're going to take some practical recommendations for achieving best practice within the classroom. So first of all, what do we mean by assessment literacy? Well, I'd like to just introduce this quotation from Glenn Fulcher in 2012. And he says assessment literacy refers to the knowledge, skills, and abilities required to design, maintain, or evaluate either large-scale standardized and/or classroom-based assessments. It also includes the familiarity with everyday test processes and awareness of the kinds of principles and concepts which underpin our practice. And for him, this also includes ethics and codes of practice. So it's not just about the technical operations of performing a test, it's also about the fairness of test procedures themselves and the impact of test procedures on test takers and learners more generally. So in terms of assessment literacy needs, this refers to what teachers want to know about testing more generally. And there was a really good piece of research which came out earlier this year, in which a couple of researchers in language testing formed a large-scale piece of work with stakeholder groups, including language teachers. And they produced a large-scale questionnaire, in which they invited respondents to think about the kinds of aspects of assessment which are most important to them and which they feel they most need to know about in order to make assessment successful in their context. And as you can see from the diagram, they generally regarded everything as being important, but there were a couple of standout features which we're going to discuss in detail today. And as you can see, probably the most important was right at the bottom, assessment principles and interpretation, which rated very highly indeed. And then in addition to that, there were things such as scoring and rating, so which more relate to the practical aspects of everyday testing. But also rated very important was personal beliefs and attitudes towards testing as well. And this included, well, these were responses from 645. So this is a fairly good overview of the kinds of things that teachers find important in tests. So just to clarify a little bit more, some of the things that came out as priorities for language teachers included assessment in language pedagogy, which is why I've included assessment for learning in today's session. Because assessment for language pedagogy very much is about how can we actually embed assessment in our everyday practice. How can we use assessments for diagnostic purposes, for example? So do we want to be able to use assessment information to provide effective feedback for learners? And what is the impact of assessment on motivation as well? So is this something that can inspire learners to learn more? Or is it something that can detract learners from their learning experience? We also look at assessment principles and interpretation. So these are the kind of some of the bread and butter issues associated with testing, some of the core principles. So key to those are reliability and validity, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. Another aspect which came out was very important was language structure, use and development. And this very much related to language in society and how our values influence assessment design and how languages are learnt and what kind of skills are required for language learning. And also came out as really important was washback and preparation. And this refers to how assessments influences teaching. And this could be any aspect of teaching. It could be materials, it could be course design, it could be the actual pedagogical practices themselves, which relates to point one. So we're going to look at these in a bit more detail. So just to clarify, assessments in language pedagogy are related very much to assessment for learning. So traditionally, we are very familiar with assessment of learning, which of course refers to the need to provide evidence in the form of. So traditionally, we undergo a period of learning or a course of instruction, and then maybe at the end of this course of instruction, there is some kind of summative test which allows us to be certified in a certain area, and then we can use that certification for other purposes, such as, for example, entering higher education. And the mandate for this summative assessment may come externally as well. So it could be school authorities, it could be a government department, it could be a testing agency, it could be some kind of test set by an institute of higher education itself as well. So assessment for learning, by contrast, this is more classroom based. It's carried out by and for the benefit of teachers and learners themselves, not for any kind of external authority. And so this is a means of assessment which can help to evaluate whether or not teaching has been successful. From a diagnostic point of view, this would be something that occurs, say, mid-course, for example, to assess progress and then inform further teaching and learning within that same class. So assessment for learning may involve traditional kinds of assessment, such as timed tests with multiple choice questions, but it could also include less formal activities, such as feedback in a verbal format. So that's the difference between those two concepts specifically. And then moving on, understanding different assessment purposes. So I would always say it doesn't matter what kind of assessment you're performing, whether it's assessment of learning or assessment for learning, that testing should always have a purpose. It's very easy to just fall into a trap of thinking we need to have a test. Okay, we have to have a test for, just because that's what we do on a language on a language program. And we give that test, we record the numbers, and this is something that's required of us by maybe our bosses, so we just simply do it and don't necessarily do anything with those test scores. And so I would say instead what we should always be thinking about is what's the purpose of this test. So if it's an externally mandated test, the purpose will be clear. Okay, it's to enter through some doorway that is currently closed for us. So we need it in order to certify to external stakeholders that we have attained a particular level of language proficiency, and therefore that allows us to progress in our education. The purpose is clear. Likewise, with assessment for learning or classroom-based assessments, there should also be a clear purpose as well. It will not be an external mandate, it will not be externally set, but it will have a purpose within teaching and learning. So within assessment for learning, we need to provide information to teachers and learners so we can make intelligent decisions about the kinds of teaching and learning that we want to happen next in the classroom. So this, of course, is a form of very low stakes assessment, as in the performance in the test won't have any kind of significant impact on your future educational opportunities. But nonetheless, we still think this is an important form of testing if it actually contributes towards positive experiences of teaching and learning. Okay, and then the external proficiency tests. This is an example, of course, of a high stakes test. And then within both of those environments, then we can talk about norm and criterion reference testing as well. This may be something that's familiar to you, but just to reiterate, A norm reference test is one in which we are comparing test takers directly against each other. So imagine you have a class of 30, you give them a test and you add up their scores. A norm referenced approach would be to rank all of your students from highest to lowest and use that range of scores to set boundaries for, say, particular grades, for example. So maybe you say that the top 10% of your class is awarded an A and the next 10% is awarded a B. Now, why that's important is that as you move from class to class, of course, the scores in the classes are going to be different. So the number of people who are awarded in a class may differ from those who are awarded an A in a different class. Additionally, the cut score could be different as well. So if the average ability of a class A, say versus a class B, is different, then the cut score for the grade boundaries within those classes will also be different. In contrast, criterion referenced approaches to testing mean that the score boundaries are fixed. Okay, and so what we're saying is that particular scores relate to particular claims about language proficiency. So we could say that the top 10% of scores are not necessarily what we're interested in. Instead, we set a score, maybe 80% within the test itself, and then 80% is always an A, regardless of who's taking the test. And then if it's the case that you have a lower ability language group and nobody gets a score of 80%, then in that situation, nobody would receive a score of A. Okay, and then those score bands relate very specifically to particular claims about language ability. So that's the difference between norm and criterion referenced testing. And within classroom-based assessment, one of the other issues that came up is that of motivation. And this is really, really important in assessment for learning, because what we want to create is an environment in which assessment actually contributes towards positive learning. We don't want this to be evaluative. We don't want to make claims about students' language proficiency on the basis of classroom-based assessment. Instead, what we want to say is, where are you currently on your language learning journey? What currently can you do in terms of your language proficiency? Which is why feedback is descriptive rather than evaluative. So when it's descriptive, when we're talking about what can language learners currently do. And then if you can provide this feedback to learners, we can also tell them where they're currently maybe lacking in terms of their language learning journey. And this will provide a basis for concentrating on those particular areas rather than areas which have already been mastered to date. So it's very much about helping the learner to become aware of the current state of their L2 development. And then if we can integrate these kind of appropriate classroom assessment activities, we believe that we can actually use this to improve learner self-esteem and motivation, rather than simply giving them an equivalent to the kinds of, say, summative high stakes assessments that might go into some poor test preparation activities. Okay, and then hopefully if we can actually improve the intrinsic reward rather than just the extrinsic reward, we can also improve levels of success as well. So because we are talking about assessment literacy today, it is absolutely crucial that we talk about some of the core areas of assessment. And one of those that is frequently spoken about in a variety of testing contexts is validity. So it doesn't really matter whether we're talking about norm referenced or criterion referenced, high stakes or low stakes assessment. One thing that joins all these together is the concept of validity. Validity is offered here in its classic definition, and this is an integrated evaluative judgment of the degree to which empirical evidence and theoretical rationales support adequacy and appropriateness of inferences and actions based on test scores. So this covers all modes of assessment. First off, it's important to note that validity is a judgment. It's not a number, and it's evaluative. So we have to say, to what extent is the test actually performing as we intend it to? So yeah, and next, it's based on empirical evidence. So there will be some numerical data which informs our determination of validity of a test, but it's also informed by theoretical rationales. In other words, the design of the test, the content of the test will go a long way towards informing our judgment as to whether or not the test is valid or not. Then we're also talking about the adequacy and appropriateness. So to what extent does the test provide enough information, and to what extent is the test information appropriate for our assessment purposes? Okay, so we're always judging the utility and validity of a test in terms of the test purpose for which we created it. And of course, then we're talking about inferences and actions. So we are making inferences in a test. We're always doing that. Again, it doesn't matter what kind of test we're talking about. We always have to infer statements about language proficiency on the basis of performance in the test. And then action. So we're always taking action on the basis of the test as well. And the action will be informed by the test purpose. So if it is a high stakes, externally mandated test, the action, of course, will be admission to higher education or something like that. In a classroom-based assessment for learning, the action will be further remedial activities or future learning or the kinds of activities that you do next in the classroom. And you're using the information you get from the test to inform that. And then finally, other modes of assessments. This, of course, relates to what I said earlier about the fact that assessment for learning can be a traditional kind of timed test with multiple choice questions, but it could equally incorporate other modes of assessment as well. So verbal or free response writing with verbal feedback, for example, could be another mode of assessment that would still need to have a validity evaluative judgment attached to it. And so just to reiterate this, Lee Cronbach in 1971, when talking about validity, said, we don't really validate a test itself, but an interpretation of data coming from that test. Okay, a test is not valid in itself, but we do make a claim that a test is valid for a specific purpose. And it's the use of the test data that we want to claim as valid. And then the second thing that we're talking about is reliability. This is a little bit different to validity in that reliability is numerical data. Okay, and this is the consistency of measurement across aspects of the testing context. So what we want to be able to achieve is if we give a test multiple times, either to different people or to the same people, we want to be clear that the test is consistently giving us useful information across different administrations. And this is what we call reliability. And different aspects of the testing context can include the date of administration. It could include different testing locations, which are held on the same date. Or in the case of productive tests, such as speaking and writing, we can talk about rater reliability as well. So if we have a single performance which is rated by two different people, will they give the same or similar score? If they're giving radically different scores, then the test, of course, is not reliable for that purpose. It is, of course, quite likely that test scores can change over time for a variety of reasons. This is not necessarily a case of unreliability, but we would have to study how test scores had changed over time. Maybe because we've changed our teaching program or our curriculum, so that we've changed the order in which certain language points are presented to students. If we do that, then that will have an impact on test scores, and it will result in changes to test scores by test takers, which is nothing to do with the test itself. It's something that we've actually physically changed about the program. So we'd have to think about the impact of that on the test. Okay, and then anything which impacts on test scores other than test taker ability in language that we're interested in is referred to as constructive relevance variance. So this could be anything. It could be the temperature at the classroom on the day. It could be the weather. It could be whether somebody's feeling ill or not. But also if the way that the tasks are designed means that we are maybe favoring people in a specific subject area, and we're not actually favoring people with stronger language ability, then that would also be a form of constructive relevant variance. In an English language test, the content of the test itself, so as in the topic area, should not impact on test scores. So we're not trying to present information to people who then have to be subject matter experts in whatever we're presenting them with. We're only interested in testing language ability. So reliability, in contrast to validity, is a property of test administration specifically. Okay, and then the next area that we wanted to talk about was language structure, use and development. And in this, it's how values influence assessment design. Okay, so of course, in high stakes assessment, it may well be the case that tests are used for accountability purposes. So in order to judge teachers and learners. So we want to know to what extent is the school or educational institution performing well. We, of course, may use test scores for that purpose. Even though the tests were not designed for that purpose, this is something that still happens. And when teachers and learners are held to accountability for the well-being or the performance of the educational institution, which is not something for which they necessarily were prepared, this can have a negative impact on morale as well. So we need to think about whether or not we want to use tests for this purpose, because this can have a negative impact on teaching and learning. Of course, our values will influence the kinds of assessment that we actually create in the first place. So if we think that a kind of measurement-driven approach to instruction can improve learning, then maybe we're less concerned about multiple choice questions and the kind of very much data-driven approaches to testing. However, if we value creativity in language learning and we want to create a communicatively oriented approach to learning, where there's lots of speaking and writing, then maybe we don't think it's appropriate to give this kind of test to our learners. Instead, maybe we're more interested in the kinds of assessments which involve freer response, speaking and writing. So we've got a trade-off here. So we could have situations where we have formal assessments with lots and lots of multiple choice questions, and that gives us lots of information about the learners. Each piece of data that comes from a multiple choice question adds to a picture of language learning proficiency by the students. Alternatively, if we value a kind of creative approach and we want free response speaking or writing, then this is something that needs to be marked using a rubric or rating scale. So this, of course, has an impact on reliability, as we've already discussed. And also it has an impact on time, because it takes, of course, time not only to get students to respond to these kind of test tasks, but then we need teacher time to actually rate the activities, the responses to the activities as well. So this is very, very time consuming for both students and learners. And then, of course, we have to consider the impact on learning that will occur as a result. So if we do give lots and lots of multiple choice questions and come up with a score, how would this score then be used to improve subsequent learning? Have we determined what each of the multiple choice questions actually relates to in terms of language learning? And can we therefore provide detailed feedback to learners? Or are we going to try and provide more bespoke feedback to learners on the basis of their speaking and writing? And then, of course, if there is pressure on teachers to spend more time actually assessing rather than in being engaged in classroom teaching and learning, then this could have a very negative impact on morale and accountability as well, as teachers become more and more invested in testing approaches rather than delivering a broad curriculum. And then, of course, we want to talk about washback today. And then just to define washback, this, as we've already spoken about a little bit, this is the effect of testing on teaching itself. And then Alderson and Wall in 1993 developed a series of what they call washback hypotheses, which I think included a number of statements, of which 5 are included specifically here. And this is that a test will influence teaching, a test will influence learning, a test will influence what teachers teach, the test will also influence how teachers teach, and a test will influence the rate and sequence of teaching as well. So it's not really necessarily possible to know exactly when or how this is likely to occur, or even how we might predict this could occur. But it is something that teachers are very, very aware of, and something that we want to actually take account of, because there are two different kinds of washback. There could be the negative kind of washback, but there could also be the positive kind of washback. And it's this kind of positive aspect that we want to improve slightly, if we can. Okay, I mean, there's a view that all washback on teaching and learning is actually negative. So some of the arguments that are now periodically rehearsed in the literature, for example, when assessments are used for accountability purposes, test scores can be published by schools or regions, and this can lead to a negative morale among teachers whose students do not score highly. And this represents, as I said, a potential shift in the use of test scores from assessments of individual learners to reporting average group performance, which can be used to evaluate teachers and educational institutions. In turn, this puts pressure on teachers to spend more time attempting to raise those average test scores rather than delivering that broad curriculum. And this is actually the opposite of the claim that we mentioned earlier, that measurement-driven instruction can actually improve learning. So many of these kind of externally mandated test forces also use large numbers of multiple choice questions. Now, typically there, of course, is a very good reason why we might want to use multiple choice questions, because the more questions you have, as I said, the more information you get about learners themselves, but also if you're using lots and lots of items, you're also raising the reliability of the test because it allows for more individual pieces of information to come together. And it's possible to create multiple choice items which can discriminate very, very well across learners at different ability levels for a particular known population. However, many teachers or many educational institutions might use multiple choice items for teaching and examination preparation at the expense of creative language learning activities. And this would be a very clear example of negative washback. Okay, so moving forwards a bit. So then thinking about the kinds of test preparation practices which could involve positive washback. This is what we want to achieve. So no test preparation practice should occur which increases students' test scores without simultaneously increasing student mastery of the content that we're actually testing. So an example of poor test preparation practice would be endless test practice itself, where we simply are preparing students to take a particular test and we just give them multiple examples of that test. So if we're preparing people to take, say, IELTS or something like that, we just give them endless examples of IELTS practice tasks. And so what we're teaching students to do in that situation is to become aware of how to complete particular kinds of tasks. So we're making them task aware, but we're not necessarily making them language aware. Instead, a better form of test practice would be to focus on the kinds of language skills that are embedded within those test tasks and to bring out those skills, identify them for the test takers, show why they're important and how they can actually develop those skills using a variety of different activities and communicative tasks. And if we're doing this, this would be a form of ethical test preparation. And therefore, the concomitance of that is the kinds of test preparation where we're simply giving people endless test preparation practice is a form of unethical test preparation practice because we're not really improving people's language or we're not seeking to improve people's language. We're simply seeking to improve their test scores by making them more test aware. So here's an example of that. So as I said, we're going to have a quick look at some practical approaches to how we might actually incorporate positive washback into teaching and learning. So imagine that we're preparing learners for a reading test or part of a test which involves reading, and we have something like the following. So this is actually from the Oxford Test of English, this particular test item. And we're presented with a short reading text and a multiple choice question. And then we're asked to simply choose the correct answer, A, B, or C, from 3 options. And here's the text. So I saw Bounce play yesterday. No, they haven't split up, and there's nothing else like them. We couldn't always hear the voices, equipment issues, but that didn't bother the fans. They went crazy as usual. That's what Bounce are all about. Then the question states, what does the blogger say was wrong with the concert? A, the performance of the band, B, the attitude of the audience, or C, the quality of the sound. The correct answer to that, of course, is C. But instead of just simply giving this task to students and then telling them the correct answers and then giving them multiple examples of this task over and over and over again until they started to get the correct answers, we would concentrate on why C is the correct answer and what kind of skills do you need in order to identify C as the correct answer. And if you look on the right, you can see that there are some kind of reading skills here which may be of use when it comes to understanding what this question is getting at. So, first of all, what might be the purpose of reading? Would it be to identify main message? Would it be to identify the purpose of the writer? Would it be to identify specific details that the writer is talking about? Do we need to perform expeditious search reading? If so, do we need to perform it at the local level? In other words, do we only need to concentrate on one sentence? Or do we need to do that at the global level, i.e. reading everything? And if we are doing that, are we searching for specific information or are we searching to understand the opinion and the attitude of the writer? Okay, or then alternatively, are we reading to identify text structure or organizational features of a text? And if we actually dig into the question a bit, we can answer that question. So we can link C, the quality of the sound, as the correct answer, to the third sentence in this, which is we couldn't always hear the voices, equipment issues, but that didn't bother the fans. So we can see the nature of the vocabulary that we're required to learn here. And we can see that the quality of the sound, quality is related to equipment, and sound relates to hearing the voices. So there's some clear parallels here that we need to know. So the crucial aspect of this is that the information we need to know C as the right answer is included within that specific sentence. Okay, so we're reading to identify the main message here. We're not necessarily engaged in expeditious search reading, and we don't really need to focus too much on the whole text. What we can do is look at other parts of the text to see why options A and B might be wrong. So what was wrong? Was it the performance of the band? No, the performance of the band is actually very positive. That's what we can get out of reading this. Was it the attitude of the audience? No, because we can see that's directly contradicted by the same sentence that we got the key for. That didn't bother the fans. So again, what we can do is concentrate on the kinds of skills, whether it's for vocabulary, the grammar that's required to answer this question correctly, whether or not we need to read everything or whether we need to focus on a specific sentence, and what strategies do we need to employ to find the relevant part of the text. And if we're doing that, that's a form of effectively a kind of like a reverse engineering. What we're doing is analyzing the content of the test tasks in order to recreate the specification of that test task. So in other words, why was that test task written? What directives were used to create that test task? And if we can identify the key skills, ability, and knowledge that the test designers try to embed within that test task, then we can use that knowledge to inform our test preparation practices. And Grabe and Stoller say this is good practice in reading pedagogy, and it is not mindless test preparation. So reverse engineering is something that we can use on a variety of test tasks, not only multiple choice, not only reading, it could be listening. We could analyze responses to speaking and writing questions and see the kinds of scores that they've been given, and then see what a positive score is associated with and what a negative score is associated with. and identify the kinds of speaking and writing skills that we're interested in and integrate those into our test preparation practices, not simply performing the same kind of test preparation practice over and over and over again. Okay, so we're coming to the end now, and what I'd just like to do is recommend some further reading to you. So more information from what we've spoken about today is available in the following publication from 2016. And then also I've got here some references which were used to inform today's talk as well. And then the 2020 reference by Benjamin Kreml and Luke Harding was published in Language Assessment Quarterly very recently. And this was all about language assessment literacy and what teachers need to know about assessment that would inform their practice positively. So thank you very much for listening to today's webinar.